I'm sitting inside the 2002 996 Porsche Twin Turbo 911. And this is a dream car for many people. It was in a time where there was a transition from powerful sports cars to ultra powerful sports cars. And we're going to talk about the interior briefly here. When I first got inside, I thought, wow, this is it? It's just slabs and slabs of plastic that feels like it's coated in leather. Everything creaks, much like it did in the C5 Corvette we were in. Now, the main negatives, aside from some of the chintziness in here, are the seats. They are so flat. There are no bolsters. I've had better experiences in the executive lounge at Spirit Airlines, and it's not something I associate with a sports car like this. The overall build quality is average, and I thought this would be a much more special feeling interior space. However, when you look at the door cards or the door panels, that's where most of the design is. There's a lot of geometry, there's a lot of lines, you have cross-stitching, and little accents here or there. But then you get to the middle section, or the armrest area, where you have the yellow that is body matched to the exterior of the car, which reminds me a lot of what the PT Cruiser had, trying to match the exterior. And I know this is a 90s car when it was designed, so you have to put it up against the other vehicles of the era. And if you look at it that way, it's great. Because one, the gauge cluster is the same it's been forever. It's completely legible. Every piece of information you need is here. The technology isn't overbearing yet, although you do have a 4-disc in-dash CD changer, which I'm afraid to even touch. Everything else looks plain, simple, and functional as hell to do what you probably are going to do in this. Take it for a weekend drive. But that's enough of the interior space. Let's head into the shop and talk about the mechanical aspects.
So Mark, I know I'm Johnny German car, but we're underneath a dream vehicle of mine, the 996 Turbo.
And I remember seeing these when they were released, and I remember all the fanfare about them, and now it's time to get technical about what this is and what it's become.
So the 996 is an extremely controversial car in the Porsche lineup. It replaced a much-loved 993. It's also the first water-cooled motor lineup for the 911, which was sacrilege to a lot of people. They viewed it as the softening up of the 911, making it a dentist's car. But in truth, this is an extremely important vehicle. It essentially, this with the Boxster and the Cayenne, saved Porsche. They were near bankruptcy, and the design team who was creating this, led by a German man named Harm and Pinky Lai, who was the designer of this vehicle, took it upon themselves to make a 911 that was more accessible to the everyday rich person. They softened it up a little bit, they made it larger, but from a technical standpoint, it is 100 pounds lighter and it is 43% more rigid than the previous car.
So this is where they changed the body structure, which accommodated or allowed them to have more flexibility and suspension setup, the all-wheel drive setup, and power output, correct?
Yes. It is an extremely impressive car from that standpoint. They dropped weight and increased power dramatically. And because it's now liquid cooled versus air cooled, it allowed them to do many other fun things with the engine.
Okay, so let's talk about the front.
So you have 3 radiators in the front. You have a central opening up here, and you have 2 in the sides. And then you have these ginormous brakes. These are aftermarket, but this was one of the first Porsche 911s to come with carbon ceramic brakes as an option. But the standard car still came with Brembo-made monoblock calipers attached to the strut front suspension.
Yeah, when you look at this, so this was using all aluminum. All the suspension components were aluminum, uprights, the knuckle design, and at least in the back, the subframe assembly is all aluminum as well. So there is a lot of firsts and a lot of high-tech stuff specifically for this generation car that now you see. It's like normal in every Porsche. But in terms of cooling, what else did they have to do up in the front here?
So there's this nice duct here as well. So because this was kind of early into the computer design world, think about it. This car came out in the late 90s, which means it was being designed in the early 90s. So they worked a lot with aerodynamic techniques for moving around airflow. You have real duct work in the front, funneling into these brakes, and all of these panels underneath feed the front radiators.
Okay.
So we made it to the rear, Mark, and before we talk about the controversial choices they made, let's talk about the all-wheel drive system. So this has a on all the time viscous all-wheel drive setup. It uses the ABD module to determine when there's a lot of slip in the rear, then it'll shove up to 45% of the power to the front. However, most of the time, you only have 15% of the torque going to the front of the car.
So it's rear-wheel drive biased, but the front is just there to aid with traction.
Yeah, when they detects a prolonged slip event done by the ABD modules, looking at wheel speed sensors and slip, it'll then send power to the front. It's derivative of the prior generation 911's all-wheel drive systems. So it's aiding a lot of the tendencies, and again, this comes from the softening up of the 911 a little bit, making it more accessible and, in the long term, faster than the prior generation cars.
And more accessible to more drivers.
Yes.
This was kind of that tipping point where you started to see, you're adding more power, more wow factor of it, but also making it easier to drive in terms of getting traction. And that's what we're seeing now today. All our supercars are kind of like, they have to be almost drive themselves.
Yeah, and this had Porsche's very early version of Porsche Stability Management, which again is, if you think about how old this car really is, it's over 20 years old, it's very sophisticated. But here's the controversial part. This is the first liquid-cooled 911 turbo. It has a lot of very interesting technology, but because this motor is derived from the earlier generation 911 turbo, it's the 993 motor. It's a Metzger-based engine, which they added liquid cooling to in a 6-speed gearbox, but it doesn't have all the IMS bearings plaguing the 996. Admittedly, that is an overblown issue. Only 1 to 5% of cars have failures, but it's one of the reasons this motor is so bulletproof. It is Porsche's first variation of variable valve timing. It's not like VTEC, where it's based upon a certain RPM. It's based upon load and various engine conditions. And it has Porsche's first variation of twin turbo technology. It is very similar to their GT1 motor that was found in their race car.
Okay. And you can see this here. This isn't completely stock. The owner isn't particularly sure about what was changed or what wasn't changed, but it has headers, it has an exhaust, it has adjustable sway bars, 3-position, it has different springs, so it has lowering springs, obviously in the front and the rear. So we're not particularly sure in terms of tuning. It does have a tune on it. He doesn't know from who or from when, so it's kind of, this whole thing is mystery meat. Now, he claims that, we haven't driven it, he claims that it all seems to function very well, which we'll find out. But everything else, like I said in the front, aluminum subframe carriers, control arms, everything is at a very high level here for its age. Now, the only thing in terms of reliability, when I looked at this the first time, coolant lines everywhere. There's lines running everywhere. And I would think from a maintenance perspective and a safety perspective, that would be the main thing that you'd want to check. So what else is going on here?
So the 996 turbos they have this reputation of being bulletproof. And it's largely well-deserved with tunes and all that other nonsense. These things can make a lot of power very reliably. However, Porsches and basically all German cars have the potential of causing you financial ruin. In this car's case, with age, you have all the coolant lines, and when they were done, all the metal fittings are only glued to this engine. So with time and all that other fun stuff, they start to break loose. So it is a engine out job. And if you go to an aftermarket shop, we've heard quotes up to, say, $3,500. But I'm sure if you took it to an actual dealership, it would be a nightmare. But past that, you have some issues with the front lines. There are basically cooling lines that run throughout the car. You have 2 giant intercoolers, you have an intercooler and an oil cooler in the back. Then you have your 3 radiators in the front. As those lines age, they begin to crack and corrode. So you have those issues. But, I mean, past that, these cars are very, very stout. The motor's excellent, and it's also a dry sump. So you don't have to deal with oiling issues.
That's good. And there's other stuff like the condenser issue with rotting out, and then you talked about it rotting out. And
yeah, so you'll lose your air conditioning and your heating and all that other nonsense.
Because of problems with blend doors and all that. Like modern, it's like nothing crazy. It's just normal stuff with a car of this age that was more particularly prone with this model.
Yeah, I mean, the motor is very, very bulletproof. It's very stout, but just know if you do pop one, you're going to go broke because it's going to be over $30,000.
That's a good time to get behind the wheel and take this for a drive. So Mark, we're in the 996 Turbo. And before we discuss what this is like to drive, listen to this. It's not, how fast were you? How fast did you go?
13 miles an hour?
13?
Yeah.
This thing is nutty. It's nutty how fast and how quickly it gets to triple-digit speeds.
Yeah, it is this was a car that made me nervous to drive, and it's not because it's necessarily intimidating. Yes, the speeds are ludicrous, but it's the fact that this was a car that I lusted after as a kid. It was on my bedroom wall. This is like meeting my hero automotively, and you and I both know a thing or two about that and how most of the time it's extremely disappointing.
Yeah, it's a strange feeling, but for me, I didn't grow up with cars on my wall. And I knew about this 911 strictly from reading about it, but I have a far more objective, I have no connection to this car. So objectively, I'm looking at it, what it was like 20 years ago versus the newer cars on the market. So how do you feel about it?
Feels like a 90s car. I don't mean that in a bad way, right? The body is nowhere as rigid as the modern 911s. The suspension, there's far more compliance in it. It uses body roll and body motion to seek mechanical grip. The steering, well, it has a lot of feedback, clearly. It doesn't have the modern directness, right? You have to move the wheel more to get the car to turn.
Right.
And then the fact that it's all-wheel drive, you're blown away by the level of grip, but I don't think it speaks to when the car is going to go horribly wrong, right? It has, you know it's going to happen, but you don't know when it's going to happen. Right. It's that danger factor.
Yeah, this doesn't have the level of communication in terms of stability. I think there's a little bit more guesswork because there's more play in everything. So my perception of this car right off the bat is there's far more torsional flex in the entire body. It feels more rubber bandy than the new cars do. So you ask what's happened in the past 20 years. Body structures are far more advanced. That's the first thing you notice. But the negative part about that is you feel far less. You get this sense of confidence from all the new cars that they literally will drive themselves, and there's far less feelings of danger. You have to get to like 130 miles an hour in modern sports cars and supercars before you're like, oh wow, I'm going fast. In this car, by the time you're hitting 80, you're like, holy shit, I'm gonna die. The adrenaline kicks in, all those juices start flowing, and that's the special part about the age and vintage of this.
There's that X factor, and the drivetrain. You and I were talking about this earlier. It feels like a jumbo jet taking off.
It does.
And that's often overused,
right.
But in this case, it legitimately, from when you step on it at 1,000 RPM, which I'm about to, to when you shift, it just pulls.
Yeah, and I made that comparison. The only thing, if you've never been in something like this, it's like that commercial airliner. When the pilot takes off, goes full throttle down a runway, you're kind of pushed back, and there's that force, the continuous force. So from the RPM band, from about 2,000 all the way to redline, all it is this smooth, flat line of torque throwing you back until you shift. And if this had a CVT, it would have that same feel of like a plane taking off. And that's one of the biggest draws, but you lose the sound. It doesn't have the theater of naturally aspirated motors. It doesn't have that connection with you. So if you like the torque and you like the forced induction turbo feel, this thing is like the best thing on the planet.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, it's incredible how fast this thing gets up to like, I can see when you see cars, they can go top speed of 190 or 200. You can see why in a car like this one, it just builds and builds and builds and doesn't stop.
What are your negatives then?
The negatives are torsional rigidity, which is also a positive. The interior is 90s car. It's not what I would anticipate. That's just not what I would think of a dream car. Like, I wanted this like special. It doesn't feel special at all on the interior. And I think a lot of the inputs are very dumb, like very soft. Everything feels delayed and soft in here. It's not the most direct feeling car, but it makes up for it in the fact that it's got a ton of character and it's timeless. Most people are never going to know this is a 20-year-old car, which speaks to how much effort they put into making this so special and all the engineering that went into it, that it's still relevant today and it's still going to be relevant in 20 years.
I mean, you have hit all my points. My only real negative for me, and you and I like cars differently, is that fear of utter financial ruin whenever I'm driving this. And because of that, because I'm worried that my bank account's gonna grenade, I could never buy this as my only car. This is the second or third car.
Agreed. And I think that's a good time to get into the final thoughts. Final thoughts on the 911 Turbo. I've had to do some serious thinking about this vehicle because I'm someone that has zero nostalgia for Porsche products. I didn't grow up with them. I never fantasized about owning one. So I'm someone that has exposure to some of their newer cars, and going back to their previous generation vehicles is a bit strange. But I will say this, if you're someone that watches this channel or understands what we talk about frequently, we truly believe that some of the golden era of sports cars was in the late 90s. There's plenty of reasons for that. One, you didn't have insane global regulations from emissions, fuel economy standards, and safety. So what you got was a great blended technology, at least in engine control, transmission control, and then you just had a sprinkle of nannies. It was the first evolution of stability, traction control, and ABS that hadn't got to the place where it is today that takes over the driving experience. And because of that, there is this strange connectedness and feeling that you get from these generation of cars, like this 911 Turbo. And that is one of the best parts about it. You still feel in a great sense of control and connectedness to this car, although it may not be the most rawest experience like the previous generation cars. You still have a great balance of everything mechanical. There's a ton of mechanical engineering that went into this car that makes it what it is. Now, the transmission, the engine, it's hard to talk about this a bit because it has an aftermarket tune, which is the tuning, at least in the temperature we drove it in, was very stable. No strangeness, no hesitation, nothing that's going to send up a red flag where there was drivability problems. However, he had an aftermarket short throw shifter, which felt great in this car. It had an aftermarket flywheel, which had a lot of chattering, a heavy-duty clutch, so it was a workout to drive it. But you could tell underneath all of that, when you softened it all up, this would make a great vehicle that you could put a lot of miles on, assuming it's reliable, and I could see myself enjoying this as a weekend vehicle. And that's how I would judge it. If you put this as a second or third vehicle in your garage and you knew what you were going to get into if you had some problems and you could plan for that, this is definitely a special car in the fact that it's completely aged well. In retrospect, it looks like a classic Porsche product with minimal gimmicks, and it is still insanely fast, even to today's standards. I appreciated driving it, and a big thanks to the owner that let us do a video on his car. We'll see you next video. Thanks for watching.